Tonight, we are going to be speaking about the battle between Russia and Ukraine, but not on some of the fronts that you may have heard about, Kherson or Zaporizhia, but instead here in Washington on K Street, the battle of lobbyists. Our guest is Ben Freeman, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, where his work focuses on how foreign governments seek to influence American government and politics. He wrote a book, The Foreign Policy Auction, on that topic, and previously was the director of the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative at the Center for International Policy. So, Ben, welcome. And just to get started, your work really centers on this foreign influence industry. And for those of the folks in our audience who might not be familiar with that industry, what is it? How does it operate? And how is it that you as an outsider are able to track their influence?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. But first of all, thank you so much for having me. I love the John Quincy Adams Society. And in fact, I love it so much. My current intern, Nick Cleveland Stout, he's an alum of the John Quincy Adams Society. So you produce some wonderful people and some wonderful researchers. To your question, though, enough dodging. Directly to your question, the industry that I look at, the foreign influence industry, it's in many ways an industry that folks really don't hear about, and that's by design. Yet we know that Foreign Agents Registration Act, registered lobbying, PR, and other firms, they receive nearly $500 million every single year from foreign powers. A majority in the countries in the world, in fact, have lobbyists working for them in DC and across the US right now as we're having this conversation. And any major foreign policy issue that you can think of involving the US, chances are there's a lobbyist working on behalf of the other countries that are involved in it. So even though a lot of times the foreign influence industry doesn't make headlines, I think it's very fair to say that it's omnipresent in just about every single US foreign policy decision.
Absolutely. So how about you take us through Russian lobbying in Washington, what they were up to before the war, what they were trying to achieve, and then what changed when the invasion happened?
Yeah, speaking of quiet foreign influence, Russia. And when people think of Russian influence, I think everybody automatically goes to the illicit influence operations from the 2016 election. I think that's what really put foreign influence on the map. And so, people think of those Russian misinformation, disinformation campaigns, that election interference type stuff the Russians were doing. But what people don't realize is that Russia spends millions and millions of dollars on perfectly legal influence in the US as well. And it's not just the Russian government. In fact, most of it is not done by the Russian government itself. It's done by individuals within Russia, Russian oligarchs, the oil companies and natural gas companies, the Russian banks as well. They lobby really aggressively. And what we've seen over the history of the Russian lobby is that they really respond to international crises. And so what happens is so some international incident will break down. We'll say hypothetically they invade a country, for example, and all heck breaks loose. That's when the lobbyists really start to go to work for Russia. And I'll fast forward and talk about the current situation in a minute. But that's what we really saw after the first invasion of Ukraine, in other incursions Russia's had as well, where the event will happen. The U.S. and the international community will respond to that. Typically, the U.S. response has been with sanctions. And so those sanctioned entities will then go and seek out lobbying public relations firms to spin their image in the U.S. or to directly try and overturn their sanctions. And I think the important thing about the Russia lobby that it's well worth your viewers knowing is that they very often, they don't just hire any lobbyists. They hire the most well-connected lobbyists that they can get their hands on. We're talking former members of Congress, former senators even, and they go directly to the executive branch itself. They're looking for those sanctions officials, and anybody in treasury, former Treasury officials, former State Department officials. anybody who might have folks on speed dial who could help these Russian oligarchs get out of these sanctions. Those are the exact type of lobbyists that these Russian folks are looking for, and that's who they've hired in the past. And as you can imagine, when you work for a Russian oligarch, the paychecks are pretty good. These are very big, lucrative contracts for some of these lobbying and PR firms. And so I think that is what a lot of these Russian entities use to sort of offset the tarnishing to their image that they might get for working with these folks. What we've seen now, fast forwarding to the current situation in Ukraine, I was tracking this Russian lobby for a while before this, and this lobbying fight that the Quincy Institute was gracious enough to publish my report on this summer, the lobbying battle before the war. We were keeping an eye on the Russian lobby long before the war broke out, and we saw this fevered battle between Russian interest and Ukrainian lobbying interest on the other side, really going head to head on a number of issues, from all these sanctions that I mentioned to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and the hard security issues too, like arms sales to Ukraine. And they're really butting heads, by and large, kind of a stalemate. And some might even say the Russian lobby had the upper hand. After all, if folks remember, before the Ukraine war, it was the Biden administration who lifted sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So then there's this great lobbying battle, but then the war breaks out. To me, that was fascinating as a social scientist research. It's almost like a controlled experiment I had where I had this great analysis going, and I'm like, what happens now? But what we saw was that in many ways the experiment ended, because when the war broke out, the sanctions this time around for the U.S., they were the severe type of sanctions, full blocking sanctions, meaning that U.S. entities could no longer have business relationships with many of these sanctioned individuals that they had previously been lobbying on behalf of. And so what the war effectively ended. The Russian lobby. Now, Russia still has some things going for it on the influence side. It still has RT in some of its normal, its other legal media influence operations. But the lobbying and PR machine that was working for Russian interests before the war, by and large, it has completely gone away now. And so what that leaves is this extraordinary Ukraine lobby to basically have their way with Washington right now.
Yeah, tell us about the Ukrainian lobby. So what were they up to before the invasion, and then how did that change things?
Yeah, great question, John. And frankly, it's the most active lobbying operation that I've ever seen. I've been investigating foreign influence now for almost 15 years. I've looked at everybody, Saudis, Emiratis, Qataris, you name it, whoever we think are the big players in this space. And the Ukraine lobby just blows them all out of the water. And they do it almost on a shoestring budget here, at least shoestring by foreign lobbying standards, only $2 million a year for the entirety of the Ukraine lobby. And I say that's not much, because if you look at the Saudis, the Emiratis, or even U.S. allies like Japan, South Korea, they're spending, 10, 15 times as much as the Ukrainians are. But the Ukraine lobby reported more political activities last year than I'd ever seen before, reported by any individual country. It was over 10,000 political activities reported by their FARA registrants. They contacted literally every single member of Congress, every member of the House, every member of the Senate, contacted just about every single executive branch agency that had anything to do with the Ukraine war, at least. They're reaching out directly to the White House, National Security Council folks. On the media side, they're talking with a who's who of media outlets, getting direct meetings in some cases with major media outlets, Wall Street Journal, New York Times reporters. And they're working really aggressively to craft that media narrative too. On the think tank side, certainly think tanks weren't left out of this space either. Ukraine's lobbyists had deep entrenched relationships with think tanks like the Atlantic Council, which also accepts money from Ukrainian interests too. So there was sort of maybe the Ukrainian lobbyists were pushing on an open door there. But we saw that they worked heavily with Atlantic Council scholars too. In fact, they contacted Atlantic Council scholars over 500 times just last year. And so what we see from all of this, you add all of this and you put this together, it is just this really expansive aggressive influence operation that was really reaching the heights of power in Washington, D.C., and really across America, too, if you think about some of these media outlets.
Yeah, and so what? I guess the Russians are pretty much gone, but what are the Ukrainians, their lobby, asking for right now? Like, what are they up to?
This is almost like a kid sitting on Santa's lap and asking. I know I'm jumping holidays ahead here, but it's effectively what the Ukraine lobby gets to do right now. Is that they get to ask for just about anything that they want. And I think what the Ukraine lobby does is effectively translate the wish list from the Ukrainian government and get it directly into policymakers' ears. And now, to be clear, the Ukraine's best lobbyist is Zelensky, hands down. He's a charismatic guy who speaks directly to the American people, directly to the Biden administration. So he's their chief lobbyist. But what the rest of the Ukraine lobbying operation does very effectively, in my opinion, is they dot the I's and they cross the T's. If Zelensky says he needs more military support, Ukrainian lobbyists are able to effectively explain what exactly that means, how much they need, and the answer to that one is usually more of all of it. We've already seen tens of billions of dollars in aid going to Ukraine. And so what the lobbyists do, they translate those demands to U.S. policymakers here. And really now they're pushing on open doors. They don't really have to have a fight with the Russian lobbyists anymore or anybody else. American politicians are very sympathetic to Ukraine right now. And so when a Ukrainian lobbyist comes in and says, here's what we need, politicians are very eager to listen to them. And I think, frankly, this campaign, their push is a big reason why we have seen some of these incredibly large Ukraine aid packages. They're the reason that we've seen, frankly, this historic level of U.S. military assistance to a country.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen, they've had a big stream of visitors coming through on meetings in Washington, and, they're clearly working a media angle pretty well, too. I saw a story in Politico a couple of weeks ago talking about the impact of Iranian-sourced drones in use by the Russians on the battlefield. And you could really, if you read the story closely, you could kind of see how the PR agency that was working for them helped, because they had brought in a bunch of Ukrainian soldiers fresh from the front to go in all these meetings. And then they had some very concrete asks in like every single one of the quotes from this soldier, who was just on the front a week ago, focused on fighting. They clearly had somebody helping them out, and they had some pretty great lines, talking about they wanted this new drone and they call it the Flying Javelin, which I thought was a great little bit of marketing there. But you mentioned a minute ago that one of the other channels of foreign influence in Washington is think tanks. So how has that looked in the Russia-Ukraine fight?
I would say in some cases it's been just as fevered as the lobbying battle. I think there are a number of think tanks around town. I already mentioned the Atlantic Council that we know that have received funding from Ukrainian interest, and that's another thing I'd love to come back to later. Think tanks don't have to disclose their funders, and so the think tanks that we're talking about, the Atlantic Council, as much as I might beat them over the head on some issues we disagree on, I do commend them for disclosing their donors and being transparent about that, unlike many think tanks actually around town. But we know the Atlantic Council has received and continues to receive funding from Ukrainian interest. Other think tanks do as well. And so what we're seeing from those think tanks, we at the Quincy Institute, a restraint-oriented think tank who would love to see a diplomatic solution to this problem, what our view of what these think tanks are doing is we think they're pushing the U.S. More into involvement in this conflict. They're making it more likely that we could see U.S. troops get involved in this at some point. And they're sort of raising the stakes of this conflict to increase the likelihood, or at least the potentiality of a direct U.S. and Russia military engagement here. And so what we at the Quincy Institute try to do as much as possible, we want to avoid that. We want to restrain foreign policy that doesn't see the U.S. going and fighting every single war that happens in the world. We were at the Quincy Institute, we were in favor of some of these arms sales packages and helping out our friends in Ukraine when they were being directly attacked. Our concern now is that I think there's a very real risk of that direct military confrontation with Russia. And so when we see some of our friends at other think tanks, calling for things like a no-fly zone or calling for more direct U.S. military support for these Ukrainian interests, we try to raise the red flag whenever we can and to point out the risks of that level of escalation, the risks of that level of U.S. military involvement.
So the Department of Justice recently issued some sort of like advisory opinion that kind of suggested that many common think tank activities might require FARA registration. So if you're sitting in the general counsel's office of one of these think tanks that does a lot of work with foreign governments, how are you reacting to this? And how do you think that this might shape the Russia-Ukraine fight?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, my reaction to that was not as that legal counsel, but as me. I was ecstatic. This is something that folks like myself, like Eli Clifton, also at the Quincy Institute, and others have been saying for years. Think tanks, in many cases, they operate very much like lobbying or public relations firms. They accept money from foreign governments to engage in work that is lobbying, that is public relations, where we know think tanks receive money to write specific reports that advance the interests of foreign powers. And so when you take, with that knowledge, if you take that and you line it up against the FARA statute, that very much looks to us like behavior that would or should require FARA registration. We lay out the case for this in a Quincy Institute report called Restoring Trust in the Think Tank Sector. And I'll spoil a little bit of it for the audience here, is that first, to restore trust in the think tank sector, Eli and I completely destroy the reader's trust in the think tank sector to point out all of these problems and to point out what we think are many glaring conflicts of interest at think tanks. So when the Department of Justice weighs in on this issue, and you see them taking this very seriously, that's welcome news for us. But if you're a legal counsel at one of these think tanks, I think this is long overdue. You might have been worried about this for a long time, and now that you see this really coming home, I think for a lot of think tanks, they're going to have to make a tough decision here. Do they preemptively, do the right thing? Do they go to DOJ? Do they register under FARA? Do they, stay completely above board? Or do they roll the dice? Do they just say, no, we're not going to register. We're going to wait till the FBI comes a knocking, and then we're going to react accordingly with that. My caution is, if they're thinking about doing that latter one, my caution is two words: John Allen. Because that's effectively what John Allen did. And there's suspicions, at least, that Brookings knew about this investigation into John Allen, the former president of Brookings. And I think John Allen's tact on this was to sort of kick this can down the road. And if you believe there was a leaked warrant that came out from the FBI about this investigation, and that had information in there indicating that, or alleging that John Allen, in fact, tried to thwart the investigation or try to obstruct the investigation. And if that's true, then, John Allen could be facing serious criminal charges for this. And I think that case alone sent a really important message to the think tank community that was not the route to go. It's not enough to, after the fact, ask for a mea culpa or even worse than that, to obstruct a DOJ investigation. So what I think will happen, and certainly what I hope will happen, is that some of these think tanks that are taking a lot of money from foreign governments and doing their bidding, they'll do the right thing. They'll register under FARA. They'll be transparent about that work. make everything above board. And because at the end of the day, I think, John, too, that there's a sort of misconception about FARA. I think FARA hear that term, they hear foreign agent, and they think it's a scarlet letter. They think we're back at the Salem witch trials again. You get that foreign agent label, and suddenly you're branded for life. And I don't think that's true at all. At the end of the day, all FARA is a transparency statute. Yes, you will register as a foreign agent, but it doesn't stop you from doing anything. There's nothing in the statute itself that blocks any speech that you might say. Doesn't block any of your lobbying activities. Doesn't say you can't do this or that for in terms of PR for your client. So I think at the end of the day, if they do register under FARA, it won't really change the way these think tanks are operating. The public will just have better awareness of these potential conflicts of interest.
So one possible reaction that someone could have to, this conversation about Russian lobbying and then Ukrainian lobbying is kind of like, well, okay, the Russian lobbying stopped. And for the Ukrainian lobbying, so what? The Russians started the war. The Ukrainians are defending themselves. They're the good guys. So why should we care, as Americans, as participants in the foreign policy discourse, that they have people in Washington kind of lining up to help them get their perspective before Congress? And I mean, you might extend that to, a lot of folks in the think tank and lobbying spaces have started to kind of make a distinction between like dictators and unfriendly governments and democratic and friendly governments. It said it's the bad thing is actually that when it's the dictatorships and the unfriendly governments that people are representing or lobbying for.
Right. And actually, directly to your point, John, there was just last week a piece of legislation introduced that would prohibit lobbying on behalf of America's, the enemies list, as we call it, which includes Russia, China, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea. And so this bill would do exactly what you're saying. It says, okay, lobbying for our enemies is a problem. So we're gonna block those guys, but we're gonna let everybody else go. As you can imagine, having read some of my work, I had a big problem with that because it leaves out a lot of America's frenemies. Our kind of friends. I don't know what we are with Saudi Arabia these days, but it certainly leaves out Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and other countries. Who I think a lot of folks in the foreign policy community see as friends. And even countries that have significant U.S. military troop presence on their soil, like Japan and South Korea. Folks don't realize that Japan and South Korea, they spend more on FARA registrants every year than just about anybody. Almost every single year, one of those two countries will lead the way when it comes to FARA spending. And people might look at that much in the same way as you described the reaction to the Ukraine lobby and say, well, that's a really good thing. Those are our buds over there. We got troop station over there, and we have a great military relationship with them. Well, on one hand, that might be true. My concern in this space is always, how are these lobbyists changing U.S. foreign policy away from what's in the best interest of the U.S.? Because we have to realize, whenever we're talking about a foreign lobbying operation, if what they're putting forward intersects with the U.S. interest, that's by chance. They are literally paid to pursue the interests of a foreign power. And that may, in many cases, that may align with U.S. interests. I think that there are a lot of what I think of as the U.S. interests that do align with our friends in Japan and South Korea. But I think in some ways their interests may not directly align with U.S. interests. And certainly when it comes to security issues, I think we're seeing this with Taiwan, for example, where what Taiwan views as its security interests, they may not align with what the U.S. interests are. They certainly may not align with what I see as a vision for a restrained foreign policy. And so when we're looking at these influence operations, whether it's from Saudi Arabia or Russia or Ukraine, the question I always have in the back of my head is, how is what they're advocating for taking us away from a restrained U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been a lot of cases in history and in current politics where like there are some of those divergences. World War One, early in World War One, before the United States joined, the British were very active in trying to encourage the United States to join, and had, kind of a pre-FARA lobbying operation that they were using. And, nowadays, like Japan, I'm pretty sure that they've lobbied for the United States to have certain nuclear weapons in our arsenal that would align well with kind of their defense needs or their vision for what the United States ought to do in the event of a nuclear exchange in the area of Japan. And I think some of the Baltic states have favored similar, relatively aggressive steps in U.S. nuclear posture, which come with certain risks that might not be the best for the United States. And then in the Taiwan case, part of what a significant component of people in Washington right now are arguing is actually that the Taiwanese are not acquiring the right sets of weapons and building the right operational concepts in order to defend themselves, independent of, whether the United States should get involved in that conflict, independent of any of those other separate higher level strategic questions. They're saying like, hey, what the Taiwanese government wants in defense terms is not actually what's best for the defense of Taiwan. So if they're representing that in Washington, it could actually be bad for Taiwan too, and bad for the United States.
Yeah. Then if I can interject real quick, John, there, I think you're 100% right. And the other issue I always like to bring up when we talk about the diverging interests between these foreign lobbies in the U.S. is when it comes to U.S. military troop presence overseas. I have David Vine's wonderful book behind me about U.S. overseas military deployments, Base Nation. And the only thing I think is missing from that wonderful book that chronicles all of that, how the U.S. got this vastly expanded military empire abroad, is the lobbying campaigns behind both getting U.S. military troop presence on their soil and keeping them. We've seen high profile instances of this recently. Qatar, for example, with Al Udeid Air Base, when the spat breaks out between Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Qatar immediately sends its lobbying operation into overdrive. And one of the big things that they promised was an expansion of the base there. And because the Saudis and the Emiratis wanted to pull the U.S. to pull troops out of that base and to shrink the size of that base. Qatar comes in and says, nope, we're going to invest in that base. We're going to keep that going and make sure that I believe it's around 5,000 U.S. military personnel stay firmly on their soil there. It's the same thing with Japan in South Korea as well. Whenever there's talk of taking those thousands of U.S. military personnel, maybe shrinking that number a little bit down, those lobbying operations go into overdrive and make the case for how important that is for security, regional stability, all those sorts of things. We saw that come to a head during the Trump administration, when he talked about not compensating those countries for the U.S. military bases there. And so I think it's examples like that where you see, divergent interests, where we have folks in the DoD saying, hey, maybe we don't need to have as many troops on foreign soil as we do. And then you get these foreign lobbies activated and they're able to, really for pennies on the dollar for them, they're able to keep that U.S. security guarantee on their soil just by spending a few $1 million on lobbyists in D.C.
And so kind of another kind of so what question on this is how much do the lobbyists actually matter? Because I was reading through your Russia-Ukraine report, you talked about it, there's a little bit of a revolving door that happens here. It's like there was a guy who went from Ted Cruz's office to being a big lobbyist against Nord Stream 2 for the Ukrainians. And it was kind of like, Ted Cruz really opposes the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This guy really opposes the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It seems like he's basically just getting paid to do what he was going to do anyway. And that, Ted Cruz isn't changing his mind because he already had this guy working for him. I mean, is this actually changing policy outcomes, changing people's minds?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think this is true also when we talk about funding of think tanks as well. This question comes up a lot. They're like, well, yeah, of course, Ukraine funded the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is pro-Ukraine. So they're some of the biggest Russia hawks around. Of course, they gave money to the Russia hawks. That's what they're going to do. And it's a fair point to make. I think what happens is for the ecosystem overall, what this does is it hands microphones to certain people and not others. So right now, that former staffer for Ted Cruz, because he's working for a firm, Yorktown Solutions, that gets over $1 million a year from Ukrainian interests, he suddenly handed a microphone, and he can blast those interests out. He can send these emails to the Hill, hire a team of lobbyists, get folks in to contact a lot of offices that he might not have otherwise been able to contact on his own. As zealous as he was as a staffer, and as zealous as his former boss is about being a Russia hawk, putting the lobbying money in from these foreign governments, it really adds an accelerant. It adds fuel to the fire of these people who might have ideologically already seen that particular way. I do think there are some cases, though, where you find, and they're rarer, frankly, where we see these sort of about faces from folks where they appear to turn the tide on different governments throughout the course of their career. One that's coming to mind to me right now is Representative Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, former member of Congress, former high-ranking member of Congress, chair of House Foreign Affairs Committee, for example. She had some very choice remarks for the United Arab Emirates while she was a member of Congress, including bemoaning some of their human rights issues there. Fast forward a few years, she retires from Congress, and guess what? She becomes a lobbyist for the UAE. And then has some very favorable things to say about the United Arab Emirates. Examples like that are very rare, I will admit, though. So I always defer back to the foreign money being more of the influence being just providing those microphones to folks who might not have otherwise had.
And so, you've mentioned how the Russians have really stopped a lot of their formal lobbying since the invasion and since a lot of these sanctions came into place. So do you think that influence is just gone, or do you think that they're maybe stepping up their influence through other channels?
Yeah, I absolutely think it's happening through other channels. And I had said this very early on, that when we saw the sort of the decimation of the Russian lobby, for lack of a better word, I called it then that because of what that happening, that the Russians were just going to turn to more illicit influence operations. We know they have those capabilities already, and if they're not having this outlet through the legal channels, they would still try to get influence in whatever way they could. I also think, too, that I may be a bit of a cynic about the foreign influence industry. I think I'm a realist, but one of my contentions is that there is never somebody so heinous in the world that a lobbyist at least one lobbyist in DC will not represent them. There's nobody that bad. I've just seen far too many of the world's worst despots, oligarchs, kleptocrats, you name it, and they've had a lobbyist or a PR flack working for them in DC. And what I think is going to happen with Russia, Russia's going to be no exception to this. I think, as time wears on, it's probably happening right now, frankly. Some folks are probably working on behalf of Russian interests and not registering under FARA. And I think what we're going to see going forward is if and when some of these sanctions on Russian entities start to get lifted or loosened, you're going to see a flood of folks coming back and working for these Russian interests all over again. We've just seen it too many times. Going back, I was just writing a little bit this afternoon about the Saudi lobby. And, if we look back to the post-Khashoggi era for the Saudi lobby, if you reflect on that time, Saudi Arabia was a pariah. Everybody around town, lobbying, PR firms dropping them, even think tanks saying they're not going to take Saudi money. Heavens, couldn't imagine that. But fast forward, I just wrote a piece for The Intercept on this a few weeks back. Fast forward a few years, Everybody is back working for the Saudis again. In fact, Open Secrets just reported that 2021 was the biggest year on record for the Saudis in the post-Khashoggi era in terms of total spending for the Saudi lobby. So with time heals all wounds on K Street.
Yeah. So one of the interesting kind of imbalances that shows up in your Russia-Ukraine report is that the Russians spent more than the Ukrainians, including on straight up lobbying that wasn't kind of a pass through to support their media operations. They spent more and they got like 20 something contacts out of that. Whereas the Ukrainians spent, maybe like half of that and got like thousands and thousands of interactions through that. What was going on there?
Yeah, I love this question, John. Thank you, because this lets me be the FARA nerd that I hope I grow up to be. This comes down to an issue of the absolute flaws in the transparency of lobbying statutes in the U.S. Two issues were at play here with the Russia's really low reported political activities. We know they were doing more than that. We know, and unequivocally, we know they were doing far more than that. My friends on the Hill tell me they were doing more than that. We know these Russian lobbyists weren't just sitting on their hands. Two big things were at play here. One, and probably the most important one, is that so many of the lobbying and the PR firms working on behalf of Russian interests were not registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. They were registered under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which is sort of the corollary statute to FARA. FARA is designed to focus mostly on foreign governments, foreign political parties, that sort of thing. But there's a carve out in FARA that you don't have to register under FARA if you are a bona fide business entity. This is the so-called commercial exemption for FARA. In many of these the Russian oligarchs, the Russian sanctioned banks, gas firms, all of these types of companies, they were claiming this commercial exemption and registering under the Lobbying Disclosure Act instead of FARA. And the reason they're doing that is under the LDA. I jokingly call it the lobbying non-disclosure statute, because you really don't have to report that much under the LDA. You have to say, "Yay, I'm a lobbyist. I'm representing these folks. Here's about what they paid me. Here are the couple lobbyists we got working on it, and here are the general issues that we were working on." And then the issues can be so broad as to say, "Oh, we lobbied in relation to the National Defense Authorization Act." So we know that's over 1,000-page document. Which part were you lobbying on? So you really don't get a lot of transparency when folks register under the LDA. And a lot of the Russian oligarchs that we were looking at, that's where they were registered. So we didn't get that information. And then thing two, some of the Russian firms who were registered under FARA, they, I think, underreported, or I would argue that they were not in fully compliance with the FARA statute. In that they didn't report their political activities, or they would just report them in sort of generic paragraph statements to say, effectively, we lobbied against sanctions and just sort of moved on. And what the FARA statute requires, the FARA statute is actually, pretty rigorous in terms of the transparency it requires. Requires you to list every single meeting you have with congressional staff, for example, media folks. List every single meeting you had with them, who they were, who they worked for, what the date was, and provide a general description of what you talked about with them. And so you get these wonderful records of the work these lobbyists are doing, so we can sort of keep an eye on them and kind of know which offices are meeting with them the most, that sort of thing. The Ukraine lobby did that, and while I might not agree with all the aims of the Ukraine lobby, you have to commend them for being just fantastically transparent. I think they followed FARA to the letter of the law. All of their filings were on time, fully compliant, got all the information in there. So a nerd like me could track these over 10,000 political activities.
Yeah, so just looking at that kind of FARA LDA framework, do you think that this current legal regime is doing a decent job of getting that kind of transparency that you're talking about? Do you think there might be some broad strokes, some new characteristics of a system that might be better? And then also, like, there's kind of a political culture element to this as well. All these senators and stuff have no problem going and doing this kind of work after they retire. Is it more of a culture problem or a legal problem or both?
I think it's both. I think I really struggle with this question about is the structure we have good, bad, or ugly? Because on one hand, I've done some work writing to foreign governments that were, or at least writing in foreign publications for governments that are thinking about doing their own FARA-like statutes. And so I can compare it to abroad. And if we look abroad, FARA is so much better than what any other government out there has on the books. Australia has a system. It's called FITS, Foreign Influence Transparency Statute. It's a shell of what FARA is. Other countries have similar bills too. Russia actually has a FARA-like statute, but they use it mostly to stifle civil society groups. It's a tool of repression for them. It's not in any way done in the spirit of FARA. So there's a lot of these statutes out there, and if you compare FARA to them, FARA is the best. FARA is better than any of those. But whenever I write one of these pieces to, hey, England, you're thinking about doing the statute. Do what we do, just do it better. FARA might be the best that's out there. It is still just fantastically flawed, and in just so many ways. The FARA unit is considering some reforms to it. So they had a public comment period that was opened up earlier this year, and I and about 24 other FARA nerds, we submitted our public comments saying what we should, how they should reform the way they're regulating it. And there's so many things that need to be fixed in FARA. It doesn't have civil penalties, for example. The only thing it has is our criminal penalties. So if they want to actually enforce the act, they have to threaten to put you in jail. And there's actually, ripped from the headlines, there was a case this morning with casino mogul Steve Wynn, who the FARA unit the Department of Justice, I should say, tried to use a civil authority just to compel Steve Wynn to register under FARA for work he did for China. And Steve Wynn fought it. The FARA unit, they're incredibly nice folks. If they think you're violating FARA, they just send you a nice letter. And they say, hey, buddy, I think you should register under FARA. And yet they sent this letter and made these contacts with Steve Wynn. And Steve Wynn still said, nope. Not going to register under FARA. And so then FARA tried to compel that registration, took him to court. And the case actually got overturned. The DOJ is probably going to appeal it. But as of now, Wynn still doesn't have to register under FARA because the civil tools available for FARA enforcement are just so woefully inadequate. So it was another thing I would fix. There's a lot of proposals in Congress to fix some of these things, but the civil fines it is a big one.
Wanted to ask you about, you've been talking a lot about the work that you're doing here to track all these foreign influence efforts. So I'm going to drop in the chat a link to an internship, or I think a couple of internships that you currently have open that are taking applications for the next through the 24th of October. I'm curious, what are these interns going to be doing? What kind of folks are you looking for here?
Yeah, I jokingly say to our current interns, I'm trying to build you up so you can take my job. I secretly don't want to do this work. I would rather be a snorkeling instructor in Florida. My current intern, Nick Cleveland Sal, as I mentioned, John Quincy Society alum, he refuses to take the offer, and he's gone on to do great and wonderful work. But I joke, but in a nutshell, we're hoping to train the next foreign influence and national. It's not just the internship's not just about the foreign influence work too. My wonderful colleague Bill Hartung, the intern will also be working with him. He does amazing work on Pentagon spending, wasteful spending in the military. and he's one of the leading arms sales experts as well. And so what Bill and I hope for with our interns is that we want to create the next great expert in these fields. We want to create the next great, whether that person becomes an investigative journalist or a muckraking think tanker like Bill or I, goes into academia to tackle some of these issues that we highlight. We're hoping to build the bench, and what our interns do is what we do. There's a practice in DC that I not affectionately call intellectual piracy, where you intern for somebody, you do the research, you do the writing, sometimes all of it, and then somebody more senior than you puts their name on it. I think that is thievery, and we do none of that. We very, very much frown upon scholars who do that. So if you work for us, you will do research. We are going to push you. We do really hard research, and we're going to push you to do great research. And we are really going to push you to write too. We're looking for folks who can both research and write well and write succinctly. None of this academic stuff you're used to. You will not be writing a semester report for us. If you can't say it in 750 words, probably nobody in this crazy DC climate is going to read it. So we're looking for folks who can write, do good research, write succinctly, and really aren't afraid to tackle some really powerful people here. I mentioned some of these lobbying operations we go up against and that I write about. These are some of the largest corporations in the world in some cases. They have literally hundreds of lobbyists and PR pros on staff. And then Bill on the other side, he's just going up against the largest bureaucracy in the world, the Department of Defense. So no pressure there either. So we're looking for folks who won't blink when we've got to call out corruption or wasteful spending, or get our hands into this crazy DC swamp in whatever fashion it is. So if that sounds like fun, please apply. And I see a question from Jennifer there. And the internship is absolutely paid. I believe I want to say it's $16 an hour, but it'll say that in the ad there.
Yeah, and so we've got another question from Renate in the audience asking, can you discuss the relationship of lobbies and think tanks to the press? I actually remember, when I worked on the editing side of the national interest, I looked up my email address in the FARA database years later, and I could find a few emails that lobbyists had sent me that they had to disclose. But I'm curious what your thoughts are here.
Yeah, it's always humbling when you go to the FARA database and you Google your name and you're like, oh gosh, I'm in here. It's a great question. And it's a key part of the overall influence operation. Think tanks, I work at a think tank, and I should have led with this, I confess. My name's Ben Freeman and I work at a think tank. And then I write about all the bad things that think tanks are doing. But as a think tanker, we try to work hand in hand with the press. As much as I think my wonderful research is, if nobody reads it, it's useless. And so I need to work hand in hand with the press to get that information out there and to make sure as many folks as possible read my work. And so hopefully that translates into changing the way people act and hopefully changing our foreign influence laws. So as a think tanker, we work directly with the press. We're trying to influence them all the time. In the lobbies, they're the sort of other prong in this. The lobbyists work directly with the think tanks. They're trying to influence that research. And they're also working directly with the press folks too. They're trying to get press folks to report on stories that make their clients look favorable, or if there's a story, right now in the OPEC situation, for example, with Saudi Arabia, that announcement, Saudi lobbyists and PR pros are spending a lot of time talking with their media contacts, trying to shape this narrative and trying to make the Saudi case for why the OPEC decision came down. And so I really view these, and I think it's important to view these not as silos. These are incredibly interconnected spheres of influence. The lobbyists absolutely see that way. They work directly with the think tanks that can get done what they need to get done. They work with the press that can get done what they need to get done, and they'll put everybody together to provide the most impactful influence campaign that they can.
And so we've got a question from David, who asks, the press suggests we are giving the Ukrainians Russian weapons. Is this something our weapons industry wants? What is the position of Pentagon lobbyists, domestic and foreign, on some of those supply efforts?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can definitely speak directly to. I don't know the specifics about the exact weapons. I mean, there's been so many at this point. I mean, who can keep track of all the weapons? My colleague Bill Hartone could. I take that back. He's got a running tally of all the weapons going into Ukraine. But in terms of the lobbying side, I can absolutely speak to. I've spent a lot of time looking at the military contractors, influence operations as well. They're lobbyists. And in fact, I'm speaking on a panel next week about exactly this topic. That's the think tank military industrial complex. And what in terms of the Ukrainian situation, in many ways, the U.S. defense contractors are working hand in glove with Ukrainian lobbyists pushing for these Ukraine aid packages. And they haven't minced words about it either. They're on earnings calls, their CEOs are explaining to their stockholders that the war in Ukraine is good for business. And war to them is a business. War to them is profitable. And so every one of these Ukraine aid packages that goes out there, in addition to the significant Ukraine lobby push for these aid packages, defense contractors are right there with them, making sure that these billions and billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer funded military and economic assistance packages just keep riding and rolling.
Yeah, and I had seen some discussion in the war. I mean, talking about specifically Russian, or really might be more accurate to say Russian origin weapons going to Ukraine. You know, that there's a lot of leftover Russian gear in some of the eastern members of NATO, for example. And, the Ukrainian military was starting out with a lot of Russian gear integrated into its systems. They have less and less of that now. But, one of the suggestions I had heard advanced was that a lot of these countries, the eastern members of NATO, wanted to get the United States to essentially backfill and modernize their weapon stocks by giving Ukraine their old Russian gear, and then getting from the United States, from our defense industry, modern Western gear. I mean, I believe that was kind of the heart of the Polish MiG-29s to Ukraine proposal, was that the United States would immediately backfill with more modern, better Western integrated types of jets. I think the Slovakian S-300 move had a similar element where we deployed some Patriot missiles there, to replace the S-300s that the Slovakians were giving up.
Wow.
Let's see. Well, it looks like we are out of questions here. Let me drop in the chat one more time some of these upcoming events that we have before we close here. These are, again, I realized at the beginning I forgot to send these links to everybody, but we've got an event on John Quincy Adams himself with our president, Dr. David Hendrickson, who's going to be speaking about a new book that he has on the underpinnings of Adams's foreign policy thought. It's a really great book. I definitely recommend checking it out. And then we'll have a book the week after that I think a lot of folks who are interested in the think tank angle of the conversation we had tonight on how think tanks became key centers of expertise on the Middle East and kind of replaced the university area studies department that the government had originally funded in order to develop expertise on the Middle East. And I remember his thesis as basically they didn't like the conclusions that the universities were reaching. And so they got their own new experts to tell them something more in line with what they wanted to hear. But we've been speaking to Ben Freeman of the Quincy Institute. Ben, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. And everybody, thank you for coming out. Have a wonderful evening, you all.
Take care, John. Thank you all.